welcome to Deakin. My name is Simon Hannon. I'm the CEO of DeakinPrime, the corporate education arm of Deakin University. It's wonderful to have you here this morning as our guests. We, for some time now, have been running very successful lunchtime events, and we thought we would trial a series of breakfast events. And at 6 o'clock this morning, when it was 6 degrees, I thought, nutrition's not going to be good this morning. But testament to you, and thank you for tuning out for what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful presentation from Arun. This is the first in 3 of a series of 70-20-10 breakfasts that we're running. This one's going to focus on the 10, the formal aspect. And really for Deakin, 70-20-10 started to loom large in our thinking when we released a white paper about 4 years ago around demystifying 70-20-10. Has anyone seen this document? It ranks really high on Google, which is probably like that was co-authored by Kelly Gillespie, design consultants, and was based on research with a lot of corporates in Australia around the approach to 70-20-10. What I found interesting since with 70-20-10 is it's a concept that you can talk to non-learning people about, like operations managers, finance people, and explain the concept, and they get it, and they say, that makes sense, that's how we should be approaching learning in our organisation. They get the on-the-job piece, they get the coaching and mentoring piece. And so for us, it's really formed the centre of our design methodology and approach. And what's happened with the advent and development of digital and technology is it's really enabled us to put some really effective approaches around the 70 and 20 aspects. But today we're actually focusing on the 10. So, in particular, Arun's going to present the latest findings on neuroscience and how this impacts on formal learning before outlining how formal learning must transform to support a true 70-20-10 approach. Arun loves stuff to do with the brain. Can we get a picture of the brain? Yeah. We'll get really good presentation from Arun with that picture of the brain. Just to give you a little bit of background on Arun before I hand over, Arun's had over 16 years experience in e-learning in corporate and higher education and brings a significant wealth of knowledge to his role in managing DeakinPrime's digital learning solutions. He aligns with DeakinPrime's holistic approach to training and education. He works with other team members to design blended solutions that use best practice e-learning approaches, emerging technologies, and the social and informal learning techniques. Arun enjoys collaborating with subject matter experts and business stakeholders to reinvent traditional training content into innovative blended learning solutions. And he has a real passion around encouraging learner motivation, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that today. Prior to joining DeakinPrime, Arun's had roles as senior learning instructional designers, project manager, lecturing multimedia at Monash Uni, and lead designer for one of Australia's earliest learning management systems. As I said, he brings to the role a great deal of passion and flair, and I'm sure you're really going to enjoy the next 50 minutes with Arun.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks everyone for coming so early. Who knew that public transport was free before 7 o'clock? I certainly didn't. It's amazing, hey? But look, thanks for coming here. I wasn't expecting, I was worried that I would be able to get out of bed on time. But today I was going to go through, as Simon talked about, talking a bit about neuroscience, and that's where I wanted to start. That's actually a brain, not just a mistake. Then I wanted to talk a bit about a framework for the blend that we actually use here at Deakin, which I think can be used by a number of different organisations, and I think some people probably use a variation of it. And finally, I want to focus on formal learning. And the risk here is that I do get carried away with the neuroscience stuff, and because I don't have an opportunity to talk about it very often, because people like Simon and other people just say, "Oh, shut up already." So I'll try not to go too far, and I've got Morgan timing me to make sure I'm going to keep it in check. But before I go any further, I just wanted to put some context out there. And again, it's something that people may have already thought of, but I just wanted to remind ourselves, people who are in the learning space, I think at the moment, it's such a wonderful opportunity where, I know people must say this every few decades, and we're such an amazing time. But the fact that we've got technology doing what technology is doing, we've gone through the sort of crazy bit where, the .com boom, and where we were just using Flash and going through all this like technology for technology's sake, and we've come back to that sort of HTML5, what's functional, what's actually going to meet our needs. But we still have access to so many options around technology. We've got neuroscience, particularly with progressions like the functional MRIs, where we actually actually can watch people's brains as they're doing things. So it's a bit of a scam, really, because neuroscience has been around for a long time, and we actually learnt most of neuroscience by people getting hurt horribly, by people getting like shrapnel in their head or getting rail things through their brains and so on. But now we can actually really evaluate that stuff and see what's actually happening without like tearing people's brains apart, which is lovely. and bringing the technology and the neuroscience, and also I think just the immense amount of opportunities we have as learners. So even I was just reflecting on my own journey in terms of getting my head around neuroscience. I think it was about 3.5 years ago, if you asked me about neuroscience, I probably would have had a few buzzwords and that's about it. Now I've got at least 5 buzzwords, so I'm really flying. But in terms of my experience of it now, like I must have spent about $80 worth or maybe $100 worth of DeakinPrime money on books, and about $30 of my money on like a audio book. And besides that, I've just accessed people from Harvard, people from Stanford, like the top thinkers in neuroscience. I've actually linked in with them via LinkedIn. I've communicated with them. The amount of access we have today as learners is tremendous. So I think we really are in I hate to say it, I'm not going to say golden age. We're in really a brilliant opportunity as a learning community. So I'm going to kick right into the neuroscience, and we're going to start off with a neuron. Hopefully you've probably seen some neurons around. We've got about 80 billion of them. You'll hear 100 billion, but they've actually done some calculations. They've actually dissected part of the brain and extrapolated it down to 80 billion. And I don't want them to keep going because we'll probably get less neurons as they go. We've got lots of different types of cells in our brains. The neurons are probably the most interesting because they're part of the infrastructure of our brain that can actually change. There's 3 parts of our brain, really. There's parts of our brain that we come out born with where it's actually hardwired. So the way we actually breathe and we know how to breathe is actually hardwired, fortunately. There's some things that rely a bit on experience but are partly hardwired. So vision, for example, vision doesn't really kick in until some light hits the membranes and goes back to our occipital lobes, and then suddenly that hardwired element starts kicking in. But a big chunk of our brains is actually plastic, the neuroplasticity. It can actually change, it can actually rewire, and it actually wires. One of the biggest aha moments for me when I was looking at this stuff was, I can't remember whose lecture it was in, but they showed close-ups of neurons, real neurons moving around. And these are dendrites, this is an axon. And basically what happens is there's an action potential, which I don't pretend to know. I must have seen chemical explanations of axon potentials 50 times, and yet I still don't get it because I'm just so not interested in all the chemical stuff. So I should have said, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm interested in the functional elements of it and what it means for learning, which I think is probably, I'm in the right room. But really what happens is these axons, it creates an action potential, which is basically like a difference of states, which suddenly creates an attraction. More complicated, obviously, but they fly into these dendrites and they hook up, they wire together. And that's where you probably heard that expression, neurons that fire together, wire together. The more that there's that action potential, the more that sticks together, the more it wires together. One of the big aha moments for me was seeing close-ups of these dendrites, and they're literally active, wiggling around. It's funny, you think of the brain as this solid mass just sitting there doing nothing, being bored, but these dendrites were just wiggling around, waiting for this action potential to happen. And what's really struck me was that we're learning machines. We're basically wired to learn, and that's how we've evolved, that's how we've survived, and that's how we've got to where we are now as a species. So the action potential happens through thought and through basically conscious learning. So that's where we're going to go today. So yes, I've got the brain. Sorry, Simon. I just on the train on the way here, I thought I'm going to try to mime how we learn memory. So this didn't really think this through properly, so it might not work. So, so imagine that over here is a cold room. It's like an ice box. And over here, it's much warmer. And imagine that our experiences are frozen as pieces of ice, which capture all elements of what we see, what we experience. And that's one important thing. When you're talking about neuroscience, you're not just talking about the brain, you're talking about your whole neurosystem. And we learn with our bodies, and that's one thing that I wanted to emphasize today. So we actually capture experiences. So when we first capture an experience, so even today, like if I have a quick look around the room and just count how many people have actually, and where they are, who's actually wearing glasses. Don't stick your hands up. Just try to, this is a bit of a memory test, sorry. Bad instructions. So look around, try to remember where people are wearing glasses. Okay, now close your eyes and try to remember who was wearing ties and where those people are sitting. So it's an oldie. Sorry to do it to you, but basically the point is, when we first, even right now, you're experiencing sensory memory. There's a bombardment of stuff happening for you. There's the clothes on your body, there's the temperature, there's the food still sort of lurking in your digestive system. There's the visual, which is massive, and there's hearing and sensory and all this other stuff going on. Sensory memory is fleeting. And sensory memory starts out here in the sort of hottest part, because these little ice bits just melt away within, well, for example, visual sensory memory without attention being paid to it is thought to disappear within a second. So you look at something and close your eyes, it's probably got a flash of it for about a second. Auditory, about 3 or 4 seconds. Who's got teenagers? So the teenagers who, when you're lecturing your teenager or even your child, and then you say, you're not even listening because they're doing the iPhone or whatever, and they say, yes, you are, yes, I am, and they repeat what you just said. It's because of sensory memory. They're not listening. It's actually sensory memory. They've got that 4-second buffer, and from that 4-second buffer, their brain can extrapolate, oh yeah, I've heard this one before. It's about how I should clean up my room after I do this and do that. So they're not actually listening. So the sensory memory, fleeting, it goes, and fair enough too, because there's too much of it for us to take in. What happens next though, we get a bit cooler. These ice can actually stand a bit longer if we move this way, because if we pay attention to that sensory memory, what you just did then with the glasses, you actually looked visually and paid attention and turned that into short-term memory. And that attention is what creates short-term memory. Short-term memory is still really fleeting. It's quite pathetic in many ways. It's 4 chunks. They used to say 7 plus or minus 2. They've got it down to 4. Again, more studies make us more limited, it seems. But it is a cooler place. It can last a bit longer, but still not very long, and that's with attention. Now, depending on the theory you're working with here, short-term memory might be working memory. Often some people have it as a separate piece. I kind of like to think of it as separate, because for me, working memory it combines short-term memory and long-term memory, which is way over there. So, for example, if I say 2 numbers like 16 and 25, that's short-term memory. If I just say you remember those 2 numbers, that's short-term memory. If I say you to take one of them away from the other or multiply them together, suddenly you're into working memory load. You're actually trying to pull in things from your long-term memory to apply it to your short-term memory. And it's like the table it's like your workbench, basically. The good thing about working memory is it does help get it to long-term memory. If you're like putting something on your workbench repeatedly, it's gonna go there eventually. So that's working memory. Now down here is your long-term memory, and that's the cool room that you can keep this ice in for longer and it's going to last longer. And theoretically, there's no limits to long-term memory. That's what people keep saying. I haven't really looked into that one yet. But long-term memory is like the sort of goldmine of where we want to put a lot of our stuff. But what's stopping us from getting there is our hippocampus. Hippocampus is near the base stem. It's actually named after, it looks like an upside-down seahorse. That's why it's got the hippo in it, like a hippopotamus. It's actually an upside-down looking seahorse, and that's the thing that's guarding our cold room. And the hippocampus is a kind of interesting beast. It's like, I think of it as a combination between a librarian and a bouncer, because it's basically like a bored librarian who is prepared to guard stuff for us and put it in our cold room, but we have to convince the hippocampus this thing is worthwhile to get through, and I'll talk about how we do that in a sec. There's also a funny little guard dog sitting there too called the amygdala. And you may have heard of amygdala like hijacks. The amygdala is much more about emotional learning. And the amygdala is just sitting quietly, calmly for most of the times. But if it sees something which is scary, like for example, back in the day when we saw bushes move, and it was actually because a saber-toothed tiger was about to come out and kill us, that's when the amygdala would kick in, and so the bushes move, and it may be in the wind, but the amygdala's out there, the guard dog's going for it, and our executive function is saying, actually, it was wind, doesn't care. The guard dog's out and it's going for it. It pulls us back to our primitive brain, and that's kind of interesting too. Back down here is the primitive brain. Like even birds have hippocampi. Most animals have that sort of primitive, down in the limbic system, most animals have it. Up here, the more in our cortex, that's where the more developed mammals have more development. That's where executive function is actually happening, and more complex working memory and so on. And the reason that bit is bumpy isn't just like it looked good at the time. It's because we weren't, our brain size, our skull was harder to evolve than our brain. So our brain kept evolving and it ran out of room. So basically it went bumpy. If you unfold that thing, it's going to be almost the size of half of one of these tables. So it's a lot of surface area, but it didn't fit because it was something that evolved later. So I digress. So the cold storeroom, guarded by this hippocampus, who's this grumpy librarian, and the dog, which is the amygdala. And so the question is, how do we get it past them to get it into that cold room? Now, that's very simplified because the fact is our memories aren't ice, aren't just frozen in ice. What actually happens is when we actually get something in that storeroom, it actually doesn't just sit there on a shelf and we pull it out later. When we actually remember something, we recreate memories. And that's kind of crucial. We actually rebuild memories. That's why memories aren't actually very reliable. But when we actually remember something, if you think about what happened this morning when you were thinking, oh, is it worth it to get out of bed this morning? When you actually think about what happened, you're actually recreating the experience. You're actually recreating the feelings that happened. And it's not just pulling it off the shelf. You're actually rewiring those neurons together. Basically, any thoughts are actually a process of neurons wiring together through action potentials and sticking together. When you recall them, those same neurons come together again. We know this because, luckily enough, because of The Simpsons. When one of the first tests they did with someone watching The Simpsons, and when they had it hooked up to an fMRI, and someone was watching Homer Simpson, and they noticed the particular wiring that actually happened as a result, they put the TV away and they asked him about Homer Simpson. The same wiring occurred because they were recalling the memory of Homer Simpson. So Homer actually has, and everyone, Kardashians have some global kind of wiring in our brains. Scary thing, huh? So now I'm going to get into the evidence-based learning that can actually get us through that hippocampus into our long-term memory. Firstly, chunked. I talked about there being 4 chunks of memory. We know that if I say, what's an animal? Just name any animal. A dog. And name a place. Melbourne. And name an object. A ball. And name a number. 5. So what was it? So dog, Melbourne, I can't remember it now. 5 and ball, thank you. So if I, right now it's not hard to remember, but if we keep going with this and I ask you that in a few days, you'll probably forget it. You can remember it better if you actually chunk it, if you actually and use your visual cortex, which is massive, it's great, it's brilliant, it's one thing that you should really use a lot in terms of memory. If you actually imagine a dog holding a ball, maybe 5 balls, juggling them in the city centre of Melbourne. That's going to actually stick in your brain much more because you're actually chunking it together and you're using your visual cortex. Environment is something that we ignore, particularly in terms of formal learning. We actually learn with our bodies, as I mentioned before. So one experiment which I think gets this across is they got deep sea divers and they did flashcards with deep sea divers. They got some of them to learn these flashcards above water and some of them to learn below water. And then they learnt the flashcards underneath the water. That's where they learnt did their learning. Then they were tested above water and tested below water. The ones who were tested below water did better. You may have heard these tips like, now these days kids that you'd say, don't just sit at your desk and learn in that one environment because if you've got to recall it in an exam, it's going to be different. Some people use gum. When they're trying to learn something important, they chew a particular sort of gum and then when they've got to recall it, they chew that gum again. You remember the experience. You don't just remember the particular information that you're reading. Space repetition is a really big one. It's massive. So if you've got a particular bit of information that you need to learn, there's even, this is so tested now, they've even got graphs about saying, if you need to remember this in a year, this is how you should space this repetition if you've got this much time. There are actually formulas around it. We know the forgetting curve happens. That's a part of our brain. It's a really important part, actually. I really feel for the people who don't have a forgetting curve, and there are people like that. But what happens is as that forgetting curve goes down, if you actually hit it with another sort of refresher session, it's going to stick much longer. It feels like you're learning slower, and it's true, you are. If you just do like 10 hours of swatting, of like cramming, you're going to have immediate recall of that information for the short term much better. But you will know, everyone's crammed for an exam, and you lose it within a few days. So space repetition is massive. Focus is huge. I mentioned the difference between sensory and short-term memory was actually attention and focus. Part of that too with focus, there's a lot we could talk about with focus. I really like John Keller's ARCS model, ARCS, and I'll talk a bit about that later actually, if I have time. Mental models, massive as well. We know this, it's about prior knowledge and how you relate what you're seeing to and what you're learning to your existing knowledge. I like to use the metaphor, I think it was Barbara Oakley, who's a really brilliant writer in this field. who talked about an octopus. And so, you know, when you've got something in your working memory, you think of it as an octopus body, and it's thrashing around, all its tentacles are thrashing around, and it's trying to grab onto stuff in your existing brain, in your long-term memory with its tentacles. If it can grab hold of something, then it can pull the rest of its body through. If it can't, if it has no relationship to what you already know, then it's really difficult to get that working memory back into your long-term memory. Interleaved is one that people... I think it's probably less acknowledged, but there's a lot of evidence around this now that if you, I mean, the example I use is the Kerr test, and there's variations on this. And I've got references, by the way. If people are interested, they should probably contact Georgie and get my references through that. But the Kerr test is something where they did, in the 70s, they got kids to actually, 8-year-old kids to throw, and I always change the numbers on this because my memory is actually shocking, so the numbers aren't right. But they get kids to actually, the aim was to say, throw a beanbag into a bucket 4 feet away. And they got one group of kids to do it 4 feet, 4 feet, 4 feet. And they got another group of kids to do, I think it was like 2 feet and 7 feet. And just that, they never actually did 4 feet. And then at the end of a month or so, they tested, and the 2 and 7 feet were better, more effective at getting the 4 feet than just the ones who just did the 4 feet. And the reason here is, again, hippocampus isn't paying attention if you're bored. If you're just doing 4 feet, 4 feet, 4 feet, and you're yawning and just doing it, at a certain point, your hippocampus isn't paying attention. If you're having to think, okay, 2 feet, and if there's variation on the fact, you're actually having to pay more attention to it. You're having to actually work your brain on it. As an aside, and I wouldn't recommend this, they did even a test where they had lovely fonts like this, Helvetica or whatever, where you're reading content, and then they changed it to fonts that you could barely read. And people actually remembered the fonts you could barely read more than the fonts that you could read. That's not an argument that we should have bad fonts in our learning. But it's just, I think the message there is that if you work to try to engage with the content, you're going to make it stick more. Retrieval is a biggie. Probably the two biggies here. I mean, I didn't put sleep in. Sleep is actually massive, but besides sleep, there's retrieval and spaced repetition, probably the two biggest ones if I was to have to rank them. And retrieval is about, rather than just recognizing content, it's about pulling it back. So when you've got it out over there in long-term memory, when it's sitting in long-term memory, you might see something, like you might walk out of this today and you might go and see something about brain functions and about the hippocampus and the role of the hippocampus, and you'll recognise it because it's sitting in your long-term memory somewhere, and you'll say, yeah, I know that, and you'll put it away. But if you actually had to leave here and explain it to someone in 2 days, and frankly, if you knew now that you were going to explain it to someone in 2 days, you'd actually be learning much more effectively. There's no illusions of competence when you've got to retrieve. There is illusions of competence when you can recognise, because you can say, yes, I recognise that, that's familiar, I know it, and I can do it. But if you've got to pull it yourself from nothing, then there's no denial. Basically, there's no illusions of competence. So that retrieval is massive. It's been shown that, you know, if you one of the worst things you can do if you're trying to learn something is just read it over and over again. You know, even writing notes and fluorescent pens, pretty useless. They talk about using things like the Cornell method, where rather than just writing notes, you're actually asking questions in the columns. So then when you scan it later, you can actually ask yourself the questions. You're trying to retrieve it, then you can go into the stuff to actually find out the answers. You learn a bit slower, but you'll learn for longer. Multi-channel, this is a biggie because, as I mentioned, long-term memory is massive. Over here in your sort of short-term working memory, it's very limited. Your cognitive load in that working memory area is very, 4 chunks. Also, if I had what I was talking about here written in words and I was explaining it, that's shown to be worse than if I was just talking about it with no visual aids, or if I just had a visual aid explaining it. You're better at just reading it or just hearing it rather than trying to do both. Suddenly the channels through your brain are overloaded. Is that 20, Morgan? Thanks. So just focus on one channel at a time and support it with supplementary channels. So what I'm doing here with the images. Also related to that, and I won't go into it now, but you may have already heard that learning styles are a sham. I'll just put that out there. That, you know, people who say they're visual learners, and I have preferences around visual, or you know, some people prefer tactile. There's now the growing body, not all evidence, but the growing body of evidence of putting people through learning interventions based on visual and looking at their preferences and trying to line up the results. it hasn't held true. So people say that they have particular preferences, but really I think the focus is, from an L&D point of view, is to try to create experiences, trying to really know that people learn through their bodies, try to actually activate different parts of that experience, but not all at once, trying to have different foci. And finally, metacognition at the top, which is a big word for basically saying thinking about thinking or learning about learning. Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K, is a fantastic writer in this field, and she's from Stanford, which makes everyone listen to her. But she's got great stuff to say here. She's done a lot of work, and basically she's written the books, I think it's called Growth Mindset, and relates a lot to kids, but also adults. So basically what she showed was that I think this test was with kids, I can't remember, she's done with both, but I think in this instance it was kids. If kids actually had a growth mindset, basically if they understood the principle of neuroplasticity, if they understood that their brain could actually grow and learn, they were going to learn much, much more effectively than someone who thought their brain was a fixed piece. Yeah, it's a massive piece. And one of the big things we do is try to empower learners. I think that's one of the challenges here, this metacognition piece. And as Simon mentioned, one of my big areas of interest is motivation and getting that learner on board. It's because today, as you know, your business will probably come to you and say, okay, we've got this problem, fix it, give them training, give them the magic pill, and then we'll walk out of there. And then when the magic pill doesn't work, they come and say, why didn't the magic pill work? Why didn't the 3-day training work? Or why didn't these e-learning modules work? And I guess what we're trying, and I think people, I was just chatting to people before this started, and I think people get in this room that what we're trying to move away from trying to offer a magic pill. We're trying to really empower the learner to take responsibility for their own learning, and we're almost trying to provide that support for them on that journey. And part of that big piece is metacognition. It's about convincing the business that this has got to happen, that continuous learning is actually the framework now. It's not about just sticking people in an event and they'll be fixed. It's about trying to develop continuous learners. But also for the learner themselves, we've got to empower them to understand that the power of their brain and the power of their practice. And they know that, yes, spaced repetition is going to work. They know that, no, I'm not just going to read things. I've got to actually close it and retrieve it. Because, we've got to actually empower these people to learn. So I think that's partly our job. It's not necessarily just getting the subject matter across. It's actually helping each individual understand how to use their brains more effectively. So the next bit, the blended learning framework that we use, and I'm not going to, certainly talking to people beforehand, I think people get and you're here because you understand why 70-20-10 is important. What I'm hearing is, what I heard in my little anecdotal survey of people before the chat today, is that you get it, but the business doesn't necessarily get it, and they still want to have that sort of limits on, or the expectation that they just want to put someone through training, and that's it. But some of the learning trends that we have identified in particular that feed into 70-20-10 are actually up there. Maybe we can talk about that at the end in terms of what's most relevant for people. One of the things I'd say is that when you're doing these sorts of solutions, it's really essential not to get caught up on any one device or any one schema. That's not the right word. It's not any one solution, any one form. So for example, e-learning companies, which I've spent many, many years in, we'd talk about blends, we'd talk about 70-20-10, and then we'd give people e-learning modules. Face-to-face deliverers, they'd do the same patter, and then they'd give a workshop. And I think now is the time where we step back from the specifics, we look at the outcome that we want, and then we get flexible. We bring a whole toolkit to bear on how we get there. And it might not involve, it might just be a totally different solution which doesn't actually live in an LMS and it does something quite different, as long as we get that performance-based results. And I think I'll come back to that because I think that's one of the big takeaway points I'm hoping you'll get from this. This is the model that I mentioned. Sorry, you can't see over there, but basically the model that we often use for our blends. And again, we apply it each time we look at what's the most appropriate. But we start up the top with prepare, and that's about that learning mindset. I think I've covered that off about how essential it is for the learners to really have that buy-in. And so we actually, I mentioned John Keller's ARC model. The other thing that is a big inspiration for me is actually, I hate to almost admit it, sorry for the BD people in the room, but it's actually sales and marketing. Because sales and marketing, like you actually talk in terms of benefits, you talk in terms of what's in it for me. And I think as a learning community, we have a lot to learn from sales and marketing because we have to create buy-in from the learner because we're not doing it to them. We're providing it for them, and then they're having that experience for themselves. So that's massive. I can't really underestimate that. We often do that through diagnostic testing, so people get a reality check. It's through open-ended scenarios where you're trying to throw someone in a situation where they're going to experience later. You're trying to get them in a pull mode rather than a push mode. So rather than just giving them information, you're trying to make them feel that little bit uncomfortable in a scenario. You may not even have the right answers for them, because if they feel a bit uncomfortable, then they think, oh, well, I'm going to be in this situation for real. I need to actually get this information so I can have these skills, so I can deal with this scenario. And videos, short videos, priming. It might be a motivational piece from an executive. It might be a peer saying, I didn't expect to have to use this, but when I had this situation, I found that this was useful. The won-over peer, the sort of cynic peer who's been won over, is a marvellous tool for trying to win a learner over. Then the grey bits are really the formal, the 10. In this next bit is the discover piece, and that's where we actually, and that's one thing I want to stress. It's 70-20-10. The inclination is to say 10's not important. 10's actually essential, because here we can actually set up a bit of a framework. We can actually sort of get people in the right sort of frame of mind. We can introduce concepts. We can introduce learning, which they're going to then take into their experience. So what we do here is we often do things like, we often would use a workshop, but we also try to flip that workshop. So I know many of you probably know what flip content is, but I'm going to explain it because I'm sure some people don't. So with flip content, it came from schools. In the school context, it was originally, you know how you go to a school, or you went to a school, and you had the teacher talking at you at the school, and then you went home and did your homework. And so what the schools did, they flipped it. You go home and you watch the videos of the teachers, and you get that sort of information dump at home, where it's pointless having people around you. And then you did your homework in the classroom. And the point of doing your homework in the classroom, you've got your peers there, you've got the teacher there, you've got your mentor there, and so you can actually do it in a much more engaged fashion. So you're actually doing the work where it counts. And so we often try to flip content using digital content. We try to pull out that sort of knowledge element in the digital content, so the workshops actually become just that, workshops, and I'll touch on this at the end. This is the experiential piece, which is about action learning projects. It's about mini just-in-time resources. And again, I'm going to finish off with this. Those mini just-in-time resources are kind of crucial. And I'll show you an example in a tick. And finally, this consolidation piece. Because you're pushing back on this experiential learning, it is a bit scary because you don't quite know what people are going to come out from it with. So, you do want a relatively formal consolidation piece just to make sure that the gaps, the key capabilities have been hit and people are actually feeding back their learning, and you can get that sort of peer-based learning in a more organised way. And finally, embed. What sort of tools and what sort of practices have you built up here to actually keep it going with that when you've moved that away? So one example quickly is onboarding. This was an onboarding for a major insurer. And what we did here was before they came to the actual, it was actually started out as a 28-day session. And what we did was we got them, before they even enter the piece, they had a video which said, welcome, this is what you're going to be, congratulations, this is the experience that we've designed for you, and this is how you're going to be engaging with it to get the most out of this process. This was for front of staff retail, basically a role. They came into their environment. Previously what happened is they went into a training room. For the first day, they went to a training room for 25 days, and they only saw where they were going to work after that. So what we did was we tried to provide context so they could actually have some contextual learning. They hit where they actually work. They met their managers, they met their workmates, and we provided tools and a digital framework for that to happen. So the manager had a toolkit to support them, and they had a whole environment which they could go into and start digging around and do little exercises in their workplace. So there was contextualised. Then they went into the training. They did go into a 3-day training here, and that's where they could pull that training out, and they knew where they could already see what they had to do in their real life job. So it was already relevant. They were already in that pull mentality. Then after the 3 days, they weren't competent to actually, or capable to do their job yet, but they were on the work floor again, and they had a whole series of asynchronous learning events. So for example, is that 40? Yes. So they had a whole bunch of things like, you're about to do phone jacking. This is how there's a 5-minute video or 3-minute video saying, hi, you're about to do phone jacking. This is what you should be looking for. This is how you're going to do it. And this is what you should reflect on afterwards. And there was a tool for them to do that. So there's just in time little learning moments. So it wasn't, we weren't trying to cover off everything there. We were just trying to get the right concepts in place and start building a community of practice with them, doing group exercises. And then here, they were accessing information as they needed it. And then again, a 3-day session again to try to push that next level after they've had some experience to feed back into it. And then these pieces were actually just webinars as well. So you can see it was a very on-the-job focus. But the formal elements, if you take that formal element away, people would just be lost. I'm going to skip over. This was some of the interface images of it, of the learning environment that they could access whenever they wanted. These are some of the formal learning elements of it. So one thing we did here was we created personas effectively from their market segmentation. We created real people. That one of the things they wanted to do was create more empathy with their customers. So we created real stories, and they were like 2-minute stories which were interwoven through the formal workshop, but also could be accessed outside of that too. Similarly, this is an example of an e-learning bite. When they were about to do something like phone jacking or whatever, they were able to access these 2 to 3 minute little e-bites to give them some context and to give them some guidance about how to get the most from that experience. Another one that we've done is change management. So this is for a large telco. The interesting thing about this one is we actually sort of pulled it back before we actually started, and we actually focused on this sort of mindset piece, because it was actually a systems rollout, but in effect it was about change management. It wasn't so much about the system. And so the first thing we did was try to bring on board a group of champions, because we felt that was the key way that this was going to live or die. And we organised a meeting with those champions, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And we worked with those champions in terms of trying to get them ready. And people were talking to me, and this will come up in a future session, I think, the challenge with coaching and how line managers and their role in coaching is kind of crucial for a 70-20-10 experience. So I'm not going to go here because I'm doing 10 today. But what our formal sessions were with these like short espresso sessions. I think ANZ people might recognise the term. They were really short, sharp, more informal formal sessions, which were really just trying to get the mindset piece happening and trying to get that motivational piece happening. The real learning was happening with champions on the ground, or super users we called them, on the ground. Also quick reference guides and how to e-learns, which were only short. So when people actually were stumbling on a specific thing, they could clearly access what they needed to at that time, and could also go to a person for support. This was some of the collateral that we used, because one of the things we did to try to get the champions on board, initially the meeting invitation that was getting rejected by a lot of the super users that we wanted to involve. So we actually created a movie trailer. It's like in a world of, and it was talked about the problem and talked about the role of the super users. And it's a bit gimmicky, but again, we were taking that sales approach. We needed those super users in the room, and we got everyone there. I think it was one person who couldn't make it. Little things like that, which we're really trying to actually move into that more motivational piece. How do we actually get buy-in? One of the things we did with the super users is after that first session, at the beginning of the session, we said, at the end of this session, we're going to get you to actually do a selfie video. You've got 40 seconds, and the software program was called Marketing Studio. You're going to say, hi, my name is Bob. I work in this section. Next year, Marketing Studio is going to be rolled out. Here's why you should care. And they had 40 seconds to explain why their peers should care. And that suddenly put them in that sort of retrieval learning mindset. When they were listening to us explaining about the benefits, they were already tying it back to their mental models about what they thought was most relevant for them. So it increased the learning by getting them to have to be in that teaching mode later. And also it gave us great collateral to use in the process later. Okay, so the final bit is where I want to end off is some of the takeaways for formal learning with all that. So I wanted to give a quick reminder of this, knowing that short-term memory is what it is. I wanted just to flash this up there again and look and just sort of, I guess one of the things I'd suggest is when you're looking at formal learning, how does it weigh up against this? And some of the big challenges here is spaced repetition, because if you're doing a face-to-face session, it's really hard usually logistically to get people, especially if they're a distributed workforce, to get them in a room regularly. So I guess the challenge is how are you going to get that? Oh, I think I've got that in the next slide. Oh, no, sorry. I think one of the key shifts here that we're dealing with is that previously we had these formal sessions which were separate to work. It was out there. It was like people were taken out of this, put in a magic bubble where they learnt, and then taken out that magic bubble, put back in their work environment. And as you know, it didn't stick. And it doesn't stick still. And so the challenge here is how can we design formal learning that literally is integrated with work? How can we bring learning to people as opposed to get people to come to learning? That's the key challenge. And when you're thinking about formal learning, I think that's where you want to spend a bit more time about getting creative about how you can do that. The way I like to think of it is formal learning is still essential, but it's basically the scaffolding. So you're really, the learning is actually the experience. The real learning, as we know, 70-20, comes through experience and your interactions with peers and mentors and so on. But formal learning can provide a major scaffolding to help them build that up, especially when there's nothing there already. If you just say people, yeah, go have this experience, have at it, we know that that's not going to go that well potentially for most people. But if we provide some framework, some direction, even that exercise we did initially where I said, look around you, who's wearing glasses, where are they sitting? That was me providing scaffolding. In that case, it was a total bum steer. It was the wrong attention. But we can help people focus on the important things through formal learning. So some of the things that we use it for is to prime them, is to get that mindset piece happening, to really get that buy-in, that marketing element, and using things like ARCs from John Keller. Flip and frame. So that's where we're flipping content out. So we're trying to remove any people-to-people interactions, whether it be virtual or face-to-face. You don't want that time spent dumping knowledge. Sometimes knowledge has to be given, but how can that be done in a way that's not taking up that valuable human time? Human-based time is I'm a digital person from way back, but even I know that there's nothing substitute for that conversation. And frankly, even my personal opinion is even virtual learning based around people isn't quite the same as having people in the room. So we know that. I think most people would agree with that from experience. So the question is, how do we maximise the impact? When we've got people in a room, how do we actually maximise that impact? Frame it, I think I've covered that off in terms of just trying to direct people's attention about what's important, what are the key outcomes here, make sure that they are bought into those learning outcomes and what it means for them. Simulations is essential. So, when they go in the work environment, they're going to be doing things. Doing it in a face-to-face session or e-learning modules, it's a great opportunity to actually simulate what they're going to experience. Also with simulations, I'm not sure if you come across the terms near transfer and far transfer. So near transfer is if you're training people at a supermarket to actually stack shelves and you're trying to train that's near transfer, because what they actually learn is actually going to be really similar to what they're actually doing. Far transfer is something like leadership skills, where they've got to take concepts and apply it in quite a dynamic way. The learning and the application has actually got a big gap. One of the ways that you do that far transfer experience more effectively is introduce things that don't seem directly relevant. So the leadership people who've done leadership training, and you've done those building marshmallow towers or whatever you've done, those things that seem really ridiculous. That is an example of excellent far transfer training, because even though it doesn't seem directly relevant, it forces people to think about what's the concepts here and how can I apply those concepts to what I'm actually doing, which is actually a far transfer skill. So the good thing about formal simulations is they don't always need to totally mimic your real life situation. Real life is the best simulation for real life. So you can do role plays, which you'll experience in real life, but also consider informal learning how you can do, particularly for far transfer training, how you can actually do something a bit different. The key thing is there to try to maintain that buy-in. Trying to connect. So ironically, formal learning is massive in terms of trying to create social learning in the future. So having people in a room together is a massive opportunity where you can actually create those networks. You actually create little groups. You do these little things, which then when they're actually on their social networking and doing other things in a more asynchronous, distributed environment, they're more willing to engage with them because they've had that breakdown of those initial blocks of, yes, these are real people. I connected with that person. I feel comfortable and safe sharing this. And performance, and that's the one I wanted to end with today, is like, I think when you're doing formal learning, I'm not sure if people use action mapping, or I don't, who is it, Kathy Moore, who did action mapping? Google it, it's old, it's an oldie but a goldie. And her thing, it's a very simple takeaway, is that, rather than people coming in and saying, this is what people need to know, you just basically focus on what they actually need to do. And it sounds really simple, but it's so powerful. And once you focus on that action point and you track back from that, it's like, what can I do to actually help them do this thing? And training, as we know, isn't always the be-all and end-all. And sometimes it's performance boosters. And I think that's where things are really going. So I think I had this, which was I wonder if people actually get trained to look like I'm in a stock image when they do this. But the point I was trying to make here was that workshops have to actually become engaged. Like, really, it's not this, where we're doing that sort of, that usual transfer. It's actually trying to get something else happening. Using virtual classrooms so you can actually space and repeat it more often. In terms of digital, and I'm almost at the end here now, I've got these e-learning modules must die, and I'm someone who's made most of my money from e-learning modules in my life. And I think they've got, they're not going to die completely, but I think they're going to become less and less relevant. The reason for that is, if you start with a performance thing in mind, if you start with how can I boost performance at when someone actually needs to do something, how many of you have actually gone back and redone an e-learning module when you've actually got a particular task in front of you? Has anyone? So how many of you have actually gone back and read like a cheat sheet or watched a 2-minute video when you actually got a particular task, or watched reread a checklist? Quite a few people, yeah? Those are the things that boost performance. So the way I look at it is, this egg isn't a gratuitous egg. It wasn't. The way I look at it now, and I think I need a better metaphor for this, is the e-learning module is like a outside of an egg. It's a great introduction. So the e-learning module gives context. It might provide a scenario. It might provide, this is going to be relevant to you because this is authentic scenario. But in that e-learning module, you've got these little videos, you've got these little checklists, you've got these little cheat sheets. Checklist isn't something I've talked about much, but there's a guy in America who's a surgeon who's written a book on checklists, the Checklist Manifesto, and it's really powerful. And I won't go there, but Google Checklist Manifesto. So you've got these little takeaway, basically performance builders in this e-learning module. The idea is you experience the e-learning module once, and then you break it and you chuck the shells away, and then you can reuse. So this is where the metaphor falls down. You don't really reuse in a yolk, but you can reuse those bits inside it over and over again as you need it, as just-in-time resources. And that's where I wanted to end off. Is, I think for me, and I think certainly in terms of DeakinPrime, we're really focused on this question of formal learning. We're still doing the workshops, we're still doing the e-learning modules, but we're trying to focus on just in time and just enough, and questioning how can we do that most effectively. So with the workshops, how can we create those takeaways that can be used in the work experience? And even with the e-learning modules, it's much easier. We're literally building shells and building these e-learning modules have become shells for just-in-time resources. So they're introduced to them, you chuck away the shell, and then those just-in-time resources are sitting in people's learning ecosystem, and they grab them as they need them. One of the things that Simon's given me permission to mention now, because we're still in the very early stages of it, is we're actually developing an app. Obviously, there has to be an app for that. As I said, we're not caught up on using a particular tool to get a particular outcome. We are tool agnostic. But the fact is, mobile devices are perfect in many ways to really hit that just-in-time, just enough kind of moment. And that's one of the best. You're Googling, you're getting on the YouTube, and you're actually like looking up something that you need to learn, or you're just looking for that quick reference. And so we're actually now in the scoping stage of developing an app framework which can actually be used across many businesses, which can actually lend itself much more to this just-in-time resources. And we're actually investigating how that links to Tin Can API, which I'm not going to go into now. But I just wanted to flag that. You probably won't hear about it for a little while, except for when we do some piloting and some consulting around that. But yeah, I like mentioning it now because we're definitely doing it. Simon's so sold on it anyway. Simon keeps saying, I want an app. But that's where I wanted to end. I probably have some takeaways which I would have hoped that have come through, but I think I'll leave it open and just leave it to you. So I'll throw it open. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I really like your analogy of the cold room and the grumpy librarian. My question is about unlearning.
Yes.
How do we help people unlearn, and how do we accelerate that process in organizations, particularly, we're going to do things quicker, we're going to learn products, new marketplaces. How do we use what you said to accelerate that process of unlearning?
That's a really good question. One thing, I'm sorry I'm getting you Google so much, but I would encourage you to Google I can't remember what it's called, something like riding a backwards bicycle. And this guy actually did, it's a very simple thing. He actually got a bike and wired it up. I'm going to be relevant here. I'm going to get there. He got a bicycle and did it so when you turn that way, the wheel actually turns that way. And when you turn that way, it turns the other way. So it's totally counterintuitive. And it's actually impossible for most people, or almost, like they showed hundreds of people doing it and no one could ride the bike initially. And so he's actually learnt a way of riding this bicycle, and that's now wired into his brain. And so the question was, he understood on a knowledge base that he had to turn it that way and he had to go that way. And this is a bit different because it's not just declarative memory, it's actually a motor cortex thing in terms of a physical thing, but it has similarities. That he understood what has to happen, but he still couldn't get his body, he couldn't change those habits. Interestingly, he got his son to do it. He was like maybe 8 years old or something, and his son did it in 2 weeks. It took him 8 months to make that change. Then once he made that change, he couldn't ride a normal bicycle. What was really fascinating is they showed the moment when he actually made the change, and it seemed sudden. He said, this wasn't faked, and I do actually believe him. The neural pathways are forming there, but there was this hardwired other pathway that was going, and finally it said, the hippocampus and the brain said, okay, already, we're going to go this way. And it was like bang and shift, and it was the sudden shift. And how you speed that up, I think the only way you can do it is by the same principles I've used, is like basically buy-in is massive because it's going to take work, and acknowledging that it's going to take work, and then telling people how they can do it most efficiently, how they can basically leverage off I even use them, you can hack your brain to do this most effectively by doing this, by learning it this way, by actually applying this way. Habits and reward are massive, so they're massively linked. So I think reward doesn't have to be money. Reward could be payoff. Like that insurance one I showed had badging. That's a form of reward. So that sort of gamification element too. So I think that's probably another element. Sorry, yep.
It's actually not a question. I'm not quite sure if it's completely relevant, but there's a guy down on South Bank who has one of those bikes. Yeah. He puts the sticky tape out, and if you can ride it past the line, you get $20, the next line $50. And I was standing there watching, and this kid jumped on. Yeah. Because the skipper's watching people do it and try it. And the kid got on, and he crossed his arms and just started pedaling. And he's clever. So it's a different way. I don't know how that matches.
Yeah, please.
I have a background in action methods. I totally get experiences and the power of anything. However, and I've learned also about learners being uncomfortable, you've got to make them comfortable to gather information. There's one problem in an organisational setting, in that in the evaluation that learners would give you would not be good because they are uncomfortable, and therefore, it's the facilitator and this whole process. So how do you get a buy-in?
That's a really good point, because in fact, I've raised that with some clients actually, because initially, in terms of, we can play to illusions of competence, and we can just give information that just validate people, oh yeah, I know this, I'm clever, and they'll give us all the right ticks at the end. So that's an excellent point, and I think part of that is trying to get that education around metacognition. We don't call it that, but basically to the business and to the learners, you are going to take longer because this is going to stick longer. And if you actually position that, it was interesting, one of the, we pretty much do a learn-to-learn type of, whether it be video or module now with most of our solutions, because we know without that framework, without people actually understanding, it's still us doing it to them. It's still us like being the ones, and they're the rats, and they're going to understand in the end. We can't do that anymore. We've got to create buy-in straight up. So I think for me, it's that primer piece. They've got to get buy-in. They've got to understand that they aren't going to get it straight away. And we can even show them stats. There's so many great examples of people learning maths problems, doing whatever, and taking longer, but knowing it for longer. So yeah, it's a toughie. The evaluation system isn't quite built for it. Yep.
I just had a quick question with respect to the neuroscience. I'm doing work in developing learning resources. I'm constantly bombarded now about people wanting to do everything by distance and by spot. It's all the time, like there's that pressure. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, we were talking about the sensory system, the way you're learning that, how much of a difference do you think it makes for someone to be physically present with other people like you? I know it's a very general question, but I'm just curious as to, because I'm getting this all the time, and I've always had intuitively a sense that it needs to be blended. We need to have time we're actually together for me to get a lot of the stuff across that I need to do. And I'm sure a lot of facilitators would say the same thing. But what's your sort of take?
Well, I'm biased. I'm a digital-based person, but I would say that you can overestimate what needs to be done in a face-to-face physical context. And I think if you actually look at what you're trying to do in that context and you pull all the sort of other stuff out, the key thing that you're trying to do in that physical face-to-face section, that physical experience, is potentially networking and collaborating. And anything else that you're doing, And that really has a big overlap anyway. Anything else that you're doing, I think it's worth asking the question, can I do this in a digital format? That's a very simple answer, but I think it's really crucial, especially for collaboration and for networking and for people to make that human connection. But outside of that, there's so much you can... Basically, it's that flipping idea. Just make it less time that you're actually doing face-to-face, pull everything else out of it, so that time is gold and you're using it for the right purpose. Talk to you all out. I'll leave it then. I was just going to end with, I'm going to plug my blog. So I actually do a blog on neuroscience and learning. It's actually around performance, learning and creativity, which is actually called Your Incredible Brain. And I hope you get that from today, because I think our potential is just massive. And that's something I'm trying to communicate to learners as well. And it's amazing. Everyone who's got a brain has got that potential because of neuroplasticity. So even the most annoying person you can imagine, except that one person I know, has got that. So yeah, to really encourage that within your learners and to get that excitement again when you're talking to people, I think is really important. And also I really would encourage you to link up with me on LinkedIn as well. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.